In the summer of 1987, on a Tuesday morning in August, three pickup trucks turned off County Road 14 and came slowly up the gravel drive toward the farmhouse where Eldon Marsh had lived for 41 years. The first truck was Roy Dunham's a 1979 Ford with a cracked side mirror and a bumper that had been bent and straightened and bent again. The second belonged to Bud Reese, whose family had farmed the section east of the Dunham place since before the Second World War. The third truck was newer than the others, a 1985 Chevy Silverado, the color of dried wheat, and it belonged to a man named Vern Coburn. In the bed of each truck there were water containers. Large plastic tanks, the kind used for livestock, and 5-gallon jugs and old metal drums with the lids cut off. All of them empty. Every single one. Eldon Marsh was standing beside his well when the trucks came up the drive. He was 76 years old that summer, and he had the build of a man who had never stopped working, lean in the shoulders and thick through the forearms, with hands that looked like they had been made from something harder than skin. He was filling a stock tank for his cattle, watching the water come up through the pipe at the same steady pace it had come up every morning for 15 years. 8 gallons a minute. Not fast, not slow, just steady. He heard the trucks before he saw them. He recognized the sound of Roy Dunham's engine, that particular roughness in the idle, and he looked up and watched the three of them come across the last stretch of gravel before the yard. They parked in a line, and the men got out slowly the way men get out of trucks when they are not sure of their welcome. Roy Dunham came first, a big man with a sunburned neck and his cap held in both hands in front of him. Bud Reese came next, thinner than he had been the year before, with something tired in the way he moved. And then Vern Coburn stepped down from the Silverado, and he stood for a moment with his hand still on the door, and he looked at Eldon, and then he looked at the ground. Nobody said anything for a long moment. The pump on the windmill turned slowly in the morning air. The cattle moved in the pasture. Everything was ordinary, except for the three men standing in the yard with their empty tanks and their empty hands. Now let me tell you something about the silence that happened in that yard on that August morning in 1987, because I do not want you to miss it. That silence had 15 years inside it. It had the weight of every word that had been said, and the weight of every word that had not been said, and it had the particular quality of silence that only comes when the people standing inside it have arrived at a place they never expected to arrive at. And I want you to understand how this moment came to exist. I want you to understand what Eldon Marsh had done to earn it, and what it cost him, and what it cost the men standing across from him. Because this story did not begin in that yard in 1987. It began 15 years earlier in a room full of folding chairs and optimism on a Tuesday evening in April of 1972. The Sheridan County Community Center held exactly 43 farmers on the evening of April 11, 1972. 43 men in work boots and seed caps, some of them with their wives sitting in rows of metal folding chairs that scraped against the linoleum floor every time anyone shifted their weight. The room smelled like coffee and floor wax and the particular smell of men who have been outdoors all day. At the front of the room, behind a folding table covered with charts and brochures, stood a man named Howard Cates. Howard was from the Bureau of Reclamation out of the Denver field office, and he had a firm handshake and a good suit, and the particular kind of confidence that comes from delivering the same presentation so many times that the words have stopped feeling like words and started feeling like facts. He had given this presentation, or a version of it, in 47 counties across the Great Plains in the previous 2 years. He knew every question the farmers would ask before they asked it. He had an answer ready for all of them, almost all of them. The message was water, specifically the Ogallala Aquifer, the largest underground reservoir in North America, stretching from South Dakota all the way down to the Texas Panhandle, holding enough water to fill Lake Huron. The Ogallala sat beneath western Kansas like a hidden ocean, and the federal government had a plan to tap it. Center pivot irrigation. Howard Cates explained it the way a man explains something wonderful to people who deserve to hear wonderful things. The technology had been around since the 1950s, he said, but now the federal government was offering something new. Subsidized loans to install the systems, low interest rates, easy terms, and water rights so inexpensive they might as well have been free. He showed charts. He showed photographs of green circles visible from the air quarter-mile wide, turning brown Kansas prairie into something that looked like Iowa. The numbers were staggering. Dryland wheat in western Kansas yielded about 25 bushels an acre in a good year. Irrigated corn yielded 140. The math was straightforward. A center pivot system cost about $35,000 for a quarter section. At 140 bushels of corn, it could be paid off in 3 good years. Gentlemen, Howard Cates said the water is already there. It has been sitting under your feet for 10,000 years. All you have to do is pump it. Every farmer in that room signed up that night. Every farmer except one. Eldon Marsh was 61 years old in April of 1972. He had farmed 320 acres of dryland wheat in Sheridan County since 1933, the worst year of the Dust Bowl, the year the sky turned black and the topsoil blew east to Chicago and beyond. He had been 22 years old that year, just married to Loretta, just starting, and the land had tried to kill him before he had planted his first crop. He had survived not by borrowing, not by expanding, not by chasing whatever technology the government or the banks or the implement dealers said was going to change everything. He had survived by doing one thing. He refused to depend on anything he could not control. Eldon sat in the back row of the community center that April evening and listened to every word Howard Cates said. He looked at the charts. He studied the loan terms. He read the projected yield numbers carefully, the way a man reads a contract rather than an advertisement. When the sign-up sheets came around and every farmer in the row ahead of him put his name down, Eldon passed the sheet to the man behind him without picking up the pen. He did not make a speech. He did not say anything to anyone. He folded his copy of the brochure, put it in the chest pocket of his shirt, and waited for the meeting to end. Afterward, in the parking lot, Howard Cates caught up with him. The parking lot gravel was wet from an afternoon rain, and the community center lights threw long shadows across the cars. Mr. Marsh, Howard said, "I noticed you did not sign up. Can I answer any questions for you?" Eldon leaned against the front fender of his truck, a 1965 Ford F-25. Oh, the color of faded red held together by rust and stubbornness and 30 years of careful maintenance. He looked at Howard Cates the way a man looks at someone who is selling something that sounds too good. "How deep is the saturated thickness under Sheridan County?" Eldon said. Howard Cates adjusted the folder under his arm. "Varies," he said. "Under this county you are looking at between 100 and 200 feet of saturated thickness." "And the recharge rate," Eldon said. "How fast does the aquifer fill back up after you pump it out?" Howard hesitated. That was not a question the farmers usually asked. The recharge rate depends on rainfall and soil permeability, he said. In this part of Kansas, it is approximately half an inch per year. Eldon nodded slowly. Half an inch per year. He let those words sit in the air for a moment. And how much water does a center pivot pull out per growing season? About 18 inches of water per acre, Howard said. So you are pulling out 18 inches and putting back half an inch. Howard Cates opened his mouth and closed it and opened it again. The aquifer has enormous capacity, Mr. Marsh. At current projected usage rates, the water will last decades, 50 years at minimum, probably longer. 50 years, Eldon said. And what happens in year 51? Howard Cates did not answer that question. He looked at Eldon Marsh for a moment, and then he looked at his folder, and then he looked at the parking lot. Nobody ever answered that question. Eldon pushed himself off the truck fender. I have been farming this ground for 39 years, he said. My father farmed it before me. The only thing I have learned in 39 years is this. Free water does not exist. Somebody always pays. If it is not you, it is your son. If it is not your son, it is the land. He got in his truck. I appreciate the offer, he said through the window, but I will find my own water. He drove home. Now let me tell you about Eldon Marsh, because the question he asked in that parking lot did not come out of nowhere. It did not come from a book, and it did not come from a university, and it did not come from anything the federal government had ever taught him. That question came from a field, and from a man, and from a morning in 1933 that Eldon had carried inside him for 39 years like a stone in his pocket. The spring of 1933 was the worst spring in the history of Sheridan County. The drought had been building for 2 years, but 1933 was the year it became something else. It became a catastrophe that looked like weather, but moved like a living thing. The topsoil dried and loosened, and the wind came and picked it up, and what had been farmland became something that had no name in any language the people of western Kansas had ever needed before. Eldon was 22 years old. He had married Loretta Calloway the previous October, a woman from the next county over, small and quiet and steadier than anyone he had ever known. They were living in the farmhouse his father had built in 1908, and they were 3 weeks away from planting their first crop, and the sky on the morning of April 14th turned the color of something that should not exist in the daytime. Walt Marsh, Eldon's father, was 54 years old that spring. He had farmed the same 320 acres since before Eldon was born. He was not a man who talked much, not because he had nothing to say, but because he had learned over the years that most of what needed saying could be said without words if you were paying attention. On the morning after the worst of the storms, when the air had settled enough to breathe without a cloth over your face, Walt Marsh walked out into the field where the topsoil had blown away and left the raw subsoil exposed beneath it. He walked out to the middle of the field, and he stood there, and he waited for Eldon to follow him, which Eldon did. They stood together in the ruined field. Walt reached down and picked up a handful of the dry, dead earth. He held it up and opened his fingers and let the wind take it away grain by grain until there was nothing left in his palm. The land will outlast everything you borrow against it, Walt said. You can lose money, you can lose equipment, you can lose a crop, you can even lose a year or two. But if you borrow against what you cannot replace, you lose the land, and then there is nothing to come back to. That was all he said. He turned and walked back toward the house, and Eldon stood alone in the field for a while looking at the raw subsoil, and then he followed. Eldon Marsh was 22 years old when his father said those words. He was 61 years old, standing in that parking lot in April of 1972. In between, he had heard 100 different versions of the same argument, each one newer and shinier than the last, each one promising that this time the math was different, this time the technology had changed the equation, this time the risk was manageable. And every time without being dramatic about it and without needing to explain himself to anyone, he had gone home and done the arithmetic, and the arithmetic always came out the same. The morning after the community center meeting, Eldon drove his old farm tractor to the northeast corner of his property. That corner was the lowest point on his 320 acres, where a shallow draw collected rainwater in the spring, and the grass stayed green a week longer than anywhere else on his land. He had been watching that draw for 39 years. He knew exactly what it meant. What? Somewhere beneath that draw, the water table was closer to the surface than anywhere else on his property. Not the Ogallala. The Ogallala was 150 feet down in that part of the county, a buried ocean pressing its weight against the rock below. What Eldon was thinking about was something shallower, a perched water table sitting in a lens of gravel and sand 30 or 40 feet below the surface, fed not by ancient accumulated rainfall, but by local rainwater filtering down through the soil year after year. It was smaller than the Ogallala the way a creek is smaller than a river, but it was his, and it recharged every year. He did not hire a drilling rig. He could not afford one, and beyond the money he did not trust them. A drilling rig punched straight through everything, through gravel and sand and clay and rock at the same speed without telling you anything about what it was going through. Eldon wanted to know every inch of what was under his ground. He started digging by hand. He used a round-point spade and a pickaxe and a hand winch he rigged from the frame of an old hay carrier. He dug the hole 4 feet across straight down, and he lined the walls as he went with field stones he had been pulling out of his fields and piling along the fence rows for 39 years. He dug in the mornings before the heat built, and again in the evenings when the shadow of the windmill reached the hole. 61 years old, lean as wire, going down. His neighbors drove past and stared. Some of them stopped. One morning in May, a man named Rudy Terhorst pulled over and got out of his truck and walked to the edge of the hole and looked down. Eldon was 8 feet down by then, shoveling dirt into the bucket on the winch rope. Eldon, Rudy said. What in God's name are you doing? Digging a well, Eldon said. By hand. That is right. Rudy shook his head. The government will put in a center pivot for $35,000 on a 20-year loan at 4%, he said, and you are out here digging a hole with a shovel. That is right. You have lost your mind, Rudy said. Eldon did not look up from his digging. Maybe, he said. Rudy stood at the edge of the hole for another minute watching. Then he got back in his truck and drove away. It was Vern Coburn who made the most noise about it. Vern ran the John Deere dealership in Hawker, the county seat, and in the spring and summer of 1972, his showroom was the most optimistic place in Sheridan County. He had sold more irrigation equipment in the first 6 months of that year than in any previous full year of business. He drove a new pickup and wore boots that had not seen a muddy field since the previous decade, and he had the easy confidence of a man who has learned to mistake a good market for personal wisdom. One afternoon in June, Vern drove past the northeast corner of Eldon's property and saw the mound of excavated dirt and the hand winch and Eldon's truck parked at the edge of the field. He slowed down. 2 other trucks were coming up the road behind him, farmers he knew, and Vern stopped and waited until they pulled up alongside. "You know what old Eldon is doing out there?" Vern said. "He is digging a well by hand, with a shovel." He pointed at the excavation as though it required pointing out. The other men looked. "The man is farming like it is 1935, Vern said. "Dryland wheat, no irrigation, no new equipment. Driving a tractor that is older than his grandkids." He paused. "The man is a museum piece. In 5 years he will be bankrupt, and I will be selling his land to someone who knows what to do with it." He said this loud enough to be heard clearly in the particular way of a man who wants his opinion on the record, who wants witnesses to his certainty. He was not cruel about it. He was not angry about it. He said it the way a man states an obvious fact, with the mild impatience of someone who has already thought through what everyone else is still catching up to. It was not malice. It was something that in some ways is harder to argue with than malice. It was contempt dressed up as common sense. Eldon was 12 feet down in the hole when this happened. He could hear the trucks on the road. He went on digging. At 37 feet on a Wednesday morning in mid-August, his pickaxe broke through into wet gravel. He stopped. He crouched down and pressed both palms against the gravel and held them there. He could feel the dampness against his skin. He counted slowly without meaning to. He watched a puddle form at the bottom of the shaft, small at first and then larger, and then the water was rising faster than he could monitor it. He climbed out of the hole and sat on the edge with his boots hanging over the side, and he looked at the water 20 feet below him. He did not shout. He did not raise his fist. He sat there for a long time in the August heat looking at the water, and then he went back to work lining the walls with fieldstone. He installed a hand pump to start, and later built a small windmill pump from salvaged parts, an old air motor frame, new sucker rod, leather cups he cut himself from a piece of harness leather he had kept in the equipment shed for 20 years on the theory that leather was never truly useless. The total cost of everything, materials and hardware and fittings, came to $280. The well produced 8 gallons a minute, not much. A center pivot irrigation system used 800 gallons a minute. But Eldon was not growing irrigated corn. He was growing dryland wheat, the same crop his father had grown, a crop built to survive on rain rather than pipes. The well was for his house and his livestock and his garden, and for one other purpose that Eldon did not explain to anyone who asked except Loretta. The evening he finished the well, he sat with Loretta at the kitchen table after supper, and he poured himself a glass of water from the hand pump at the sink. He held the glass up and looked at the water in it. "Someday," he said, "the big water is going to run out. The Ogallala. The way they are pumping it, it is going to run out. And when it does, this little water is going to be the most valuable thing in the county." Loretta looked at him across the table. She had known Eldon Marsh for 31 years by then, and she had married him because she understood that he thought about things longer and more carefully than most people she had ever known, and she had never once had reason to revise that judgment. "How long until it runs out?" she said. 15 years, he said. Maybe 20. Depends on how hard they pump. Loretta looked out the window at the corner of the property, where the windmill turned slowly in the evening wind. She was quiet for a moment. "You are either the smartest man in Kansas or the craziest," she said. Eldon looked at the glass of water. "Might be both," he said. And that was all they said about it that night. Now let me tell you what happened in those first 2 years after the community center meeting, because you need to understand what Eldon was watching from his dryland fields before I take you to the night in 1974 when everything inside him wavered. The transformation was visible from the air. Within 12 months of that April meeting, 22 center pivot irrigation systems had been installed in Sheridan County. Within 2 years, the number was 37. Where there had been a patchwork of brown dryland fields, wheat and sorghum and fallow ground, there were now green circles, perfect and enormous, each one a quarter-mile across, fed by underground water pumped through aluminum pipes by diesel engines running through the night. Corn, irrigated corn, yielding 130, 140, 150 bushels an acre. The grain elevator in Hawker had to build a new storage facility. The bank on Main Street stayed open late on Fridays. Land that had been selling for $80 an acre in 1970 was selling for $300 by 1976. Vern Coburn's dealership was the busiest business in the county. Eldon's neighbors did not say much to him directly. But at the co-op, at the elevator, at the diner on Tuesday mornings where the farmers gathered for coffee before the markets opened, the sentiment was consistent, and it was not unkind exactly. It was the sympathy reserved for someone who is clearly making a mistake and clearly cannot see it. Poor old Eldon, they said. Sitting on 320 acres that could be gold and too stubborn to dig for it. He heard it, he did not respond to it, he went home and worked. But here is what happened in the fall of 1974 that I want you to sit with for a moment, because this is the part of the story that most people who tell it leave out. Vern Coburn threw a party that October, a customer appreciation night at his dealership to celebrate 2 years of record sales. He invited everyone in the county, farmers and their wives, the banker, the county agent, the pastor from the Lutheran church. He put up a tent in the parking lot and hired a barbecue outfit from Colby. You could hear the music from the county road. Loretta heard about it from Edna Terhorst, Rudy's wife, who called on the telephone. Loretta told Eldon about it at dinner that night. She told it the way she told him most news, without editorializing, just the facts laid out plainly so he could do with them what he wanted. Eldon did not say anything during dinner. After he washed the dishes and Loretta was reading in the front room, he went to the small room off the kitchen where he kept his files and his almanacs and the notebooks he had kept since 1947. He took the geological survey report he had gotten from the state office in Topeka the previous spring and spread it on the table alongside the topographic maps of Sheridan County and a notebook where he had been writing down figures he collected whenever he could get them. He sat at that table for a long time. Have you ever been inside a certainty that you could not prove to anyone else that existed only in your own calculations, in your own reading of things that other people had stopped looking at? Have you ever held a position that felt completely true to you and completely invisible to everyone around you, and sat inside the gap between those two conditions until the gap started to feel like doubt rather than foresight? If you have been in a room like that, you know something about the man who sat at that table on an October night in 1974. Corbett Eldon's son was 34 years old that year. He had been working alongside his father since he was old enough to drive a tractor, and he had his father's build and something of his father's patience, though not all of it. He was good with machinery and good with soil, and he was beginning in the way that sons sometimes do to measure the life his father had chosen against the lives of the men around them. Corbett came over that evening. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and he looked at his father in the other room with the maps and the notebooks, and after a while he got up and stood in the doorway. "Dad," he said, "are you sure about all of this?" Eldon looked up from the table. He looked at his son for a moment. Corbett said, I am not trying to argue with you. I am asking. Because the Dunhams cleared $22,000 net this year on corn. Roy told me himself. And we had a decent year, but we are nowhere close to that. I know it, Eldon said. Then are you sure? Eldon looked down at the maps. The geological survey figures were there in the columns. The recharge rates, the pumping estimates, the saturated thickness measurements from the test wells the state had drilled. He put his hand flat on the paper. I am still calculating, he said. Corbett stood in the doorway for a moment longer, then went back to the kitchen. He could hear his father turning pages. What Corbett could not see from the kitchen doorway, and what Loretta could see because she came quietly into the room a few minutes later and sat in the chair by the window, without saying anything, was that Eldon's hand was not completely steady on the page. Not much. Not enough for anyone who did not know him to notice. But Loretta knew him, and she noticed. She sat with him without speaking. The lamp was on, and the window was dark, and outside the windmill was turning slowly in the October wind. After a long time, Eldon looked up at her. I am not wrong, he said. The math does not change. I know it, she said. He looked back at the maps. I just want to make sure I am not wrong for the wrong reasons, he said. Loretta reached across the table and put her hand over his hand. She did not say anything else. She did not need to. Eldon sat at that table until after midnight. When he finally came to bed, Loretta was awake, but she did not say anything, and he lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and ran the numbers one more time in his head. Recharge rate half an inch per year. Pumping rate 18 inches per growing season. Saturated thickness 150 feet. 37 farms in the county now running center pivots. He calculated it 2 different ways and got the same answer both times, and he went to sleep. The next morning he drove his tractor out to the well at the northeast corner of his property and stood beside it while the windmill pump ran and the water came up the pipe at 8 gallons a minute. He put his hand under the flow and felt the water hit his palm cold and steady and absolutely indifferent to the arguments of men. He was not wrong. He went back to work. The seasons that followed had a rhythm to them that was different from his neighbor's rhythm, but no less demanding. Dryland wheat requires a different kind of attention than irrigated corn. It requires attention to the soil itself, to its moisture content, and its organic structure, to the rotation of crops that keeps the ground alive through years when the rain does not come the way you planned. It requires attention to the sky and the wind and the particular quality of the air on a March morning when something in it tells you whether to plant now or wait a week. Eldon gave it that attention. He kept his notebooks. He kept his soil healthy by rotating wheat with sorghum and letting some ground lie fallow in years when it needed rest. He drove the same machinery he had been driving for 20 years, and he maintained it with the kind of care that makes things last. Not because he was sentimental about old equipment, but because paid-off equipment was the only kind that made sense. His yields in those years were modest. 22, sometimes 28 bushels an acre when the rain cooperated. Nothing like the numbers coming off the irrigated fields, but his costs were also modest. No irrigation payments, no equipment loans, no operating debt to carry into the next year if prices dropped. He saved money every year, not a lot, but consistently the way a man saves money who has decided that the absence of debt is its own kind of income. His neighbors continued to feel sorry for him. At the co-op and the elevator and the Tuesday morning diner table, the opinion of Eldon Marsh remained more or less fixed. Good man, stubborn as a post, going to die on dry ground when there is a river of money flowing right under his feet. Vern Coburn had moved on from the subject of Eldon Marsh by 1975 or so. The way a man moves on from a prediction he made with too much confidence when the predicted thing has not yet happened. He did not walk back what he had said in 1972. He simply stopped saying it. The dealership was busy and the market was good, and Vern Coburn had more important things to think about. The green circles turned every year. The diesel engines ran every night. The water came up out of the Ogallala at 800 gallons a minute on 37 farms across the county, and the money flowed and the land prices climbed and the bankers were happy and the implement dealers were happy, and the farmers who had signed that night in April of 1972 drove new trucks and built new equipment sheds and talked about expanding. And beneath all of it, 3 feet deeper every year, the water table dropped. Eldon Marsh knew it. He tracked the state survey reports when they came out, and he kept his own notes on the water depth in his hand-dug well, which stayed constant because it was fed by something the Ogallala pumps could not reach. He was not dramatic about what he knew. He did not make speeches at the co-op. He did not write letters to the newspaper. He continued to farm his 320 acres the way he had always farmed them, and he waited because he had learned from his father, and from 39 years of working the ground, that the land operates on its own schedule, and patience is not the same as passivity. The most consequential things a careful man does are almost always invisible to the room until the moment they are not. And by then the only thing left to do is wait for the silence to speak for itself. The water kept rising in the northeast corner of Eldon's property, cold and steady, 8 gallons a minute, the same in July as in April, the same in a dry year as in a wet one, because it came from something small and local and sustainable rather than something vast and ancient and irreplaceable. 37 center pivots turned across Sheridan County. The Ogallala dropped 3 feet every year, and in the northeast corner of a 320-acre dryland wheat farm, a hand-dug well lined with field stones and built with a shovel, and 4 months of patience produced 8 gallons a minute without complaint, without drama, and without any acknowledgement from anyone that it was the most significant piece of infrastructure in the county. That would come later. The Kansas Geological Survey published its first comprehensive report on the Ogallala Aquifer in western Kansas in the spring of 1980. It was not a long document, 41 pages, including the tables and the maps printed on paper that felt slightly cheaper than it should have for something carrying that much information. The language was technical and careful and written in the way that scientists write when they are reasonably certain about something they know people do not want to hear. Eldon Marsh drove to the county extension office in Hawker on a Wednesday afternoon in March and picked up a copy. He sat in his truck in the parking lot and read it cover to cover before he drove home. Then he drove home and read it again at the kitchen table while Loretta made supper. The numbers were exactly what he had expected, which did not make them easier to read. Since the irrigation boom began in the early 1970s, the water table in Sheridan County had dropped an average of 3 feet per year. In some areas near the heaviest pumping activity, the decline was closer to 5 feet annually. The saturated thickness beneath the county had averaged approximately 150 feet at the start of the decade. By 1979 it had dropped to roughly 120 feet. The recharge rate remained what it had always been, half an inch per year. The report noted this figure without editorializing, which was a form of editorializing in itself. Eldon set the report on the table beside his plate and ate his supper. The next morning he drove to the copy machine at the hardware store in Hawker, which charged 25 cents a page, and he made 4 copies of the report. He kept one. He put one in an envelope and mailed it to the county extension agent. He drove to the co-op on the east side of town and left one on the counter near the coffee machine where the farmers gathered in the mornings. Then he went to Roy Dunham's place. Roy was in his equipment shed when Eldon pulled up doing something to the hydraulic lines on his newer tractor. He was a big man Roy with a deliberate way of moving that made everything he did look like it was taking slightly more effort than it needed to. He looked up when Eldon came in out of the brightness. "Got something you should read," Eldon said. He held out the folded copy of the report. Roy wiped his hands on a shop rag and took it. He looked at the cover. He turned a few pages. He handed it back. "I have seen this kind of thing before," Roy said. "They put out reports every couple years saying the aquifer is declining. Then it rains and everything evens out." "This is not that kind of report," Eldon said. Roy looked at him. Then he looked back at his tractor. "I appreciate you bringing it by, Eldon," he said. "I do. But I have got $43,000 in equipment loans and a pivot that needs to run this summer to make those payments. I cannot afford to worry about a 50-year problem right now." Eldon stood with the report in his hand. He looked at the equipment in the shed, the big new tractor, the planter, the pivot motor on its stand waiting for the season to open. All of it purchased on credit, all of it requiring a yield to justify its existence. "All right," Eldon said. He drove home. That fall he attended the county water district meeting. The meeting was held in the same community center where Howard Cates had made his presentation 8 years earlier, and there were fewer men in the chairs this time, perhaps 25, and the mood in the room was different, not worried exactly, but less celebratory than it had been in 1972. The price of corn had softened. Interest rates were beginning to move in the wrong direction. A few men in the room were carrying more debt than they had planned to be carrying at this point. The district chairman, a man named Gerald Whitmore, was explaining the county's water management framework when Eldon raised his hand. "Gerald," Eldon said, "I want to ask about the aquifer decline data. The State Geological Survey is showing 3 feet per year of drawdown. That is 150 feet of saturated thickness going to zero in 50 years. What is the district's plan for that?" The room shifted. A few men turned to look at Eldon. A few others looked at the floor. Gerald Whitmore had been the district chairman for 11 years and had the particular tolerance of a man who has learned to distinguish between problems that require action and problems that require patience. He looked at Eldon with an expression that was not unfriendly. "The aquifer will last another 50 years at current usage rates, Eldon," he said. "That is the projection from the Bureau. We will cross that bridge when we come to it." "We are building more debt every year than the aquifer can sustain," Eldon said. "The math is the same as it was in 1972. We are taking out 18 inches and putting back half an inch. That does not change." From the corner of the room near the back wall where he had been leaning with his arms crossed, Vern Coburn made a sound that was not quite a laugh. It was a sound that communicated something without needing to be a specific word. Eldon heard it. He did not look in that direction. Gerald Whitmore said, "I appreciate your concern, Eldon. I think we are all aware of the situation, but there is nothing actionable at this point in time. Eldon said, "There is nothing actionable until there is nothing left to act on." Nobody replied to that. The meeting moved on to other business. Eldon drove home and sat in his truck in the driveway for 5 minutes before he went inside. The night was clear and cold, and the stars over western Kansas were the same stars they had always been. He sat with his hands in his lap and looked at the farmhouse his father had built. He thought about the word actionable and what it meant when the people who used it were the ones who would not be around to deal with the consequences of their inaction. Then he went inside. Have you ever tried to warn someone who does not believe they have a problem? Not because they are stupid and not because they are bad people, but because the problem is still invisible to them, because the evidence is in the future and the profit is in the present, and the human mind was not built to trade present certainty for future uncertainty, even when the arithmetic is clear. Have you ever stood in a room and said a true thing and watched it pass through everyone in the room as though it had no substance? That is a particular kind of loneliness. It is not the loneliness of being disliked. It is the loneliness of being right in a language no one around you is currently able to hear. Eldon went on farming. The years between 1980 and 1982 were harder than the years before them, and not only because of the water. The farm economy was changing in ways that had nothing to do with Kansas and everything to do with decisions being made in Washington and in banks whose balance sheets had nothing on them that looked like topsoil or wheat. Paul Volcker at the Federal Reserve raised interest rates to fight inflation, and the rates went up to levels that seemed almost theoretical, 20%. And the effect on farmers who were carrying large equipment loans and land loans at variable rates was immediate and catastrophic. The money that had seemed manageable at 7% did not seem manageable at 15 or 18%. Corn prices fell. Land prices, which had climbed steadily since 1972, stopped climbing. 3 farms in Sheridan County went to the bank in 1982. Not 3 farmers who had been struggling for years. 3 farmers who had been successful by every measure that the county had agreed to use as the measure of success. Men with new equipment and irrigated acres and yields that would have seemed impossible to their fathers. The bank took the land and the equipment and the houses and the families moved. The irrigated farmers who survived did so barely because they still had water and their yields were still high even as prices fell. The irrigation kept them alive through the price crash, and they told themselves that the crisis was temporary, that prices would recover, that the worst was behind them. Most of them were right about prices recovering. None of them were thinking about the water. Eldon watched it all from his dryland fields and said nothing publicly. His own finances were not comfortable during those years. Wheat prices were down along with everything else, and 320 acres of dryland wheat at 22 bushels an acre and $1.60 per bushel was not a large income. But he had no equipment loans. He had no irrigation payments. He had no variable rate debt of any kind. His fixed costs were low and his savings, modest as they were intact. And then in the fall of 1982, Loretta got sick. It was her heart, not a heart attack, the doctor in Colby explained. A condition that would require monitoring and medication, and at some point probably a procedure. The medication alone was $65 a month, which in the context of Eldon's income was not a small number. One evening in November, Corbett drove over after supper. He sat at the kitchen table with his coffee, and he was quiet for longer than usual before he said what he had come to say. Vern Coburn made me an offer on the northeast quarter, Corbett said. $40 an acre. That is $12,800, Dad. It would cover Mom's medical costs for 4 years. Eldon was standing at the sink with his back to his son. He did not turn around immediately. Corbett said, I am not telling you what to do. I am just telling you what is available. Eldon turned around. He looked at his son for a long moment. Then he looked at the window and beyond the window at the dark field where the windmill stood at the corner of the northeast quarter. That is the quarter the well sits on, Eldon said. I know it, Corbett said. The silence in the kitchen had a particular texture to it. Outside the windmill pump ran steadily in the November wind the same way it ran in every season, indifferent to the conversations happening inside the house 40 yards away. We are not selling, Eldon said. Corbett looked at his father. He did not argue. He had known his father long enough to understand that when Eldon Marsh said a thing in that particular tone, the conversation about that thing was finished. But he drove home that night with something unresolved in him, and Eldon knew it, and after Corbett's taillights disappeared down the county road, Eldon went out and stood beside the well in the dark for a while, not to check on it, not because there was anything that needed doing. He stood there because the well was the thing that the entire argument rested on, the physical evidence of a decision made on a calculation that no one else had agreed with, and standing beside it in the dark was the closest he could come to checking the calculation one more time. The pump ran. The water came up the pipe at 8 gallons a minute. The same 8 gallons it had produced every day for 10 years. He went back inside. Loretta's condition stabilized over the following months. The medication kept her comfortable. The procedure the doctor had mentioned was deferred and then deferred again, and eventually it became clear that it would not be necessary. Eldon paid the medical bills from savings and reduced his discretionary spending to almost nothing for 2 years. And at the end of those 2 years, the savings account was thinner but not gone. He did not sell the northeast quarter. Now let me show you the numbers, because the numbers are what this story turns on, and I want you to see them clearly, the way Eldon saw them in his notebooks. In 1972, when the irrigation boom began, the saturated thickness of the Ogallala beneath Sheridan County was approximately 150 feet. That was the depth of usable water, the underground reservoir, the ancient ocean that Howard Cates had called inexhaustible. By 1980 it was 120 feet, 30 feet gone in 8 years, 3 3/4 feet per year, slightly faster than the survey had projected. By 1985 it was 105 feet, 45 feet gone since 1972. Nearly a third of the original reservoir pumped out and evaporated into Kansas corn in 13 years. By 1987 it was 90 feet, 60 feet gone, 40% of the original water. Now consider Eldon's well, 42 feet deep, fed by local rainfall percolating down through sandy soil into a gravel lens just above the bedrock. A small local renewable system that recharged every year from whatever rain fell on the land above it. In 1972 it produced 8 gallons a minute. In 1980 it produced 8 gallons a minute. In 1985 it produced 8 gallons a minute. In 1987 it produced 8 gallons a minute. The difference between those two numbers, the falling number and the steady number, is the whole story. I want you to sit with that difference for a moment. 60 feet gone on one side, 0 change on the other. And the side showing 0 change is the one that everyone laughed at. Roy Dunham was the first farmer in Sheridan County to lose his well. It happened in the summer of 1984. Roy had drilled his original irrigation well in 1972 to a depth of 130 feet. By the summer of 1984, the water table in his part of the county had dropped to 140 feet. His pump was pulling air. Roy hired a drilling contractor and went down another 60 feet at a cost of $8,000 that he did not have, and borrowed at a rate he could not comfortably afford. He hit water again at 190 feet, but the flow was half what it had been. His center pivot was designed for 800 gallons a minute. The new depth gave him 400. He planted corn anyway. He ran the pivot at reduced pressure and hoped the flow would be enough. It was not quite enough. His corn stressed in July when the heat came and the reduced water could not keep pace with the evapotranspiration demand. His yield dropped from 140 bushels to 90. He made his loan payments that year. Not comfortably. Roy was not alone. By the end of 1985, 11 wells in Sheridan County had either gone dry or lost significant capacity. Some farmers drilled deeper. Some drilled and came up with less water than they had hoped. Some began quietly to think about what dryland farming might look like if they were forced back into it, and discovered that the prospect was more complicated than they had imagined. 15 years of irrigated corn had changed their soil. The organic matter was different. The soil structure had shifted in ways that reflected a decade and a half of heavy water application and the particular demands of corn. The transition back to dryland wheat for the farmers who were beginning to consider it was not going to be as simple as just stopping the irrigation and planting wheat instead. Eldon's dryland fields had not changed. He had been farming them the same way for 50 years, rotating crops, building organic matter, resting ground that needed rest. His soil was what it had always been, healthy and consistent, and his wheat yields in those years were actually slightly better than they had been in the early 1970s. 28 to 32 bushels an acre in reasonable rain years. Modest, stable, paid for. And then there was Vern Coburn. Vern had closed the John Deere dealership in the spring of 1985. The decision was not dramatic. It was just arithmetic. Equipment sales had been falling for 2 years as the farm economy contracted, and the farmers who were having trouble with their wells and their loan payments were not buying new tractors. The inventory was sitting on the lot, and the floor plan interest was eating the margin. Vern closed the dealership, sold the inventory at a loss, and paid off what he could. He was 58 years old when the dealership closed. He still owned a quarter section of land on the south side of the county land he had held onto through the boom years as an investment rather than working it himself. With the dealership gone and time on his hands, he decided to put the land into production. He installed a center pivot in the spring of 1985. One quarter section, 160 acres. He drilled a well to 180 feet deeper than most because by 1985 everyone knew you needed to go deeper than you would have in 1972. He planted corn. He did it the way the successful farmers in the county had been doing it for 13 years because he had been watching them and selling them equipment and talking to them about their operations for all of those years, and he understood how it worked. The first year was reasonable. Yields came in at 110 bushels, which was below the peak years, but acceptable given the lower water pressure he was getting from a well at that depth. He made his pivot loan payment. Not comfortably. The second year was worse. The water table dropped another 3 feet. His flow rate declined. His corn stressed in August, his yield dropped to 80 bushels. In June of 1987, on a morning when the temperature reached 94 degrees by 10 o'clock, Vern Coburn's center pivot ran dry. His pump, pulling from 180 feet, hit the same retreating water table that had been claiming wells across the county for 3 years. The pivot stopped moving. The aluminum pipes dripped and went still. The corn in the circles below began to show the particular color that means a plant is deciding whether it has enough left to finish the season. It did not have enough. Vern's corn died in the field in July. He was the man who had called Eldon Marsh a museum piece in 1972. He was the man who had predicted bankruptcy and the sale of Eldon's land within 5 years. He was the man who had made that prediction publicly with witnesses in the particular tone of a man who considers himself to be doing everyone a service by stating the obvious. Now Vern Coburn stood in his own dead corn in the summer of 1987 and looked at a field that had cost him more money than he could easily recover. The summer of 1987 was the hottest and driest in 15 years. The dryland crops were hurting across the county. Eldon's wheat had come in light 21 bushels because the spring rains had been insufficient. But it had come in. It had been harvested. There was grain in the bin and a check from the elevator, modest but real. The irrigated crops that still had water were surviving. The ones that did not were dead. Vern Coburn's field was not the only dead field in the county, but it was one of the more visible ones sitting along the county road where everyone drove past it. On the morning of the 12th of August, which was a Tuesday, Eldon was at his well at 6 o'clock in the morning, filling his stock tank before the heat of the day made working outside difficult. He heard the trucks on the county road before he saw them. He recognized Roy Dunham's engine with its particular rough idle. He did not recognize the other two engines. He watched the three pickups come slowly up his gravel drive, and he recognized the faces when the men got out. Roy Dunham, with his cap in both hands. Bud Reese, thinner than he had been, moving carefully the way a man moves when he is tired, in a way that sleep does not fix. And Vern Coburn, stepping down from his Silverado, putting his hand on the door for a moment, and then looking at Eldon and looking at the ground. In the bed of each truck, empty containers, every size and shape of water storage vessel they had been able to find. All of them empty. Nobody said anything. The pump ran. The windmill turned slowly in the morning air. The cattle moved in the pasture behind the fence. The day was already warming. Roy Dunham spoke first. Eldon, he said, we need water for livestock. Our wells are dry. Eldon looked at the three men. He looked at the empty containers in the truck beds. He looked at his well still producing, still steady 8 gallons a minute, rising from 42 feet of hand-dug shaft lined with field stones from his own fence rows. How many head between you? Eldon said. Roy looked at Bud and at Vern. About 160 total, he said. That is a lot of water, Eldon said. We know it, Roy said. We will pay whatever you want. Eldon shook his head slowly. He was not looking at the containers anymore. He was looking at Vern Coburn, who was still looking at the ground. I seem to remember Eldon said a conversation from about 15 years back. Something about a museum piece. Something about bankruptcy and selling my land to someone who knows what to do with it. Vern Coburn looked up. His face was red, and it was not from the sun. He was 61 years old that morning, and he looked like a man who has arrived at a place he never imagined arriving at, carrying something he does not know how to set down. That was a stupid thing to say, Vern said. His voice was quiet, not performative, not the voice of a man making a public statement, just a man saying a true thing in a low voice to another man who deserved to hear it. I am sorry. The silence that followed had weight to it, the kind of silence that contains more than what was said. Eldon let it sit for exactly as long as it needed to sit. He did not rush it. He had not earned this moment by being in a hurry, and he was not going to waste it by being in a hurry now. Then he said, "Bring your tanks." Roy looked at him. Vern looked at him. Eldon said, "I will fill what I can. This well gives 8 gallons a minute, not 800. You are going to have to take turns. And you are going to have to be patient about it." He looked at the 3 men in front of him, and then at the well, and then at the surrounding land, the brown, dry fields of August, the distant glint of an idle pivot structure standing in someone's ruined corn. Patience, Eldon said, is part of the deal. He filled their tanks that morning. Roy Dunham first, then Bud Reese, then Vern Coburn, each man waiting his turn, while the windmill pump ran at 8 gallons a minute, steady and unhurried and utterly indifferent to the long argument that had preceded this morning. It took 4 hours to fill everything they had brought. 4 hours of standing in the yard in the August heat, waiting for a trickle of water to fill containers that should have been full from their own wells, if the math had worked out differently. Eldon brought out a coffee pot and set it on the tailgate of his truck, and the men drank coffee in the heat without speaking much. At some point Bud Reese said, "How long has this well been producing?" "Since 1972, Eldon said. "Same year as the pivots," Roy said. "Same year," Eldon said. Nobody said anything to that for a while. When the last of the containers was full and the men were getting back into their trucks, Roy Dunham came over and put his hand out. Eldon shook it. Roy's grip was the grip of a man who means it, not a social gesture. "We will be back tomorrow if that is all right," Roy said. "That is all right," Eldon said. "Come when you need to." Roy nodded and got in his truck. Bud Reese raised a hand as he backed out of the yard. Vern Coburn sat in his Silverado for a moment without starting the engine. He looked through the windshield at the well, at the windmill, at the pump handle, at the fieldstone lining visible at the top of the shaft. He looked at it for a long time. Then he started the engine and drove out of the yard and down the county road, and Eldon watched the Silverado until it was gone, and then he turned back to his work. He filled those tanks the next day, and the day after that. He filled them every day for the rest of that summer, every day that the men came, which was most days, because the heat did not break until the 3rd week of September, and the cattle needed water every day the heat held. The well ran at 8 gallons a minute through all of it. It did not fluctuate, it did not slow down, it did not threaten to fail. 160 head of cattle on 3 farms kept alive through the worst drought in 15 years by a hand-dug well that a 61-year-old man had built with a shovel and a pickaxe and 4 months of his own labor for $280, while everyone around him signed papers for $35,000 systems connected to an aquifer he had calculated was going to run out. Eldon did not say this. He did not need to say it. The water said it for him, 8 gallons at a time every day all summer long. And somewhere in the back of every mind that came to that well that summer, a reckoning was forming. Not an apology exactly, not a conversion, but a slow and unglamorous recognition of the difference between a confident prediction and a correct one, and the particular cost of confusing the two. The most expensive word in the English language is free. Eldon Marsh had known that since a Tuesday night in April of 1972. He had known it since 1933, standing in a ruined field with his father. He had paid the price of knowing it in years of modest yields and quiet evenings, and the loneliness of being right in a language no one around him was ready to hear. Now the language had changed, and the well kept running. The rain came back in late September of 1987. Not a flood, not a season-ending event, just a series of slow, steady fronts that moved through western Kansas every 4 or 5 days and dropped enough moisture to break the drought and bring the grass back to something that resembled its normal color. The cattle in Roy Dunham's pastures put weight back on. Bud Reese's hayfields recovered enough to give him a late cutting. The county exhaled. Eldon Marsh did not change his routine when the rain came back. He was at his well every morning at 6 o'clock, checking the pump, checking the windmill mechanism, filling the stock tank for his own cattle before the workday began. The well continued to produce 8 gallons a minute. It had produced 8 gallons a minute through the hottest and driest summer in 15 years, and it produced 8 gallons a minute when the rain was falling on the ground above it. The consistency of that number had stopped surprising Eldon a long time ago. It was simply the nature of what he had built. In the first week of October, a young man drove out from town and parked in the yard and knocked on the farmhouse door. He was perhaps 30 years old, with the look of someone who has spent enough time outdoors to be comfortable there, but enough time reading to know the difference between observation and understanding. His name was Glenn Pruitt, and he worked for the county extension service. Eldon answered the door and looked at him. "Mr. Marsh," Glenn said, "I have been hearing about your well all summer. I was hoping you might let me see it." Eldon looked at him for a moment. "Come on," he said. He put on his hat and they walked out to the northeast corner of the property. Glenn Pruitt stood at the edge of the well and looked down into it. He could see the fieldstone lining precise and careful and the dark circle of water at the bottom of the shaft. He crouched down and looked more carefully. "You dug this by hand," he said. "That is right," Eldon said. "In 1972, yes." Glenn stood back up and looked at the windmill, at the pump mechanism, at the sucker rod going down into the shaft. He walked slowly around the circumference of the well, looking at the way the stones were laid. "Mr. Marsh," he said, "do you understand that this is the only functioning private water source in the northwest quarter of the county right now? Every Ogallala well within 6 miles of here is either dry or in serious decline." "I know it," Eldon said. "This taps a completely different system, a perched water table fed by surface infiltration. It recharges annually because it is fed by local rainfall rather than ancient accumulated water." "I know that too," Eldon said. Glenn looked at him. "Why did you know it," he said, "when nobody else in the county seemed to know it, or at least nobody else acted on it?" Eldon was quiet for a moment. He looked out across his fields, at the wheat stubble from the summer's harvest, at the fence lines he had maintained for 40 years at the draw in the northeast corner, where the grass still grew a little greener and a little longer than anywhere else. "I did the arithmetic," Eldon said. "In 1972, when they were selling the center pivots, I asked Howard Cates how fast the aquifer recharges. He told me half an inch a year, and they were proposing to pull out 18 inches a year. I asked him what happens in year 51. He did not have an answer. That was the answer." Glenn nodded slowly. He took a small notebook from his shirt pocket and wrote something in it. "Did you try to tell anyone?" he said. Eldon looked at him. "I left the Geological Survey report at the co-op in 1980, he said. "Nobody read it. I went to the water district meeting and presented the drawdown numbers. They told me the aquifer would last another 50 years and I should sit down. I told Roy Dunham in 1978 his well was pulling too much. He told me to mind my own business. He paused for a moment. He was not bitter about it when he said it. He said it the way a man reports facts without embellishment and without the need to be believed or vindicated. You cannot help people who do not think they have a problem, Eldon said. You can only be ready when they figure it out. Glenn Pruitt wrote in his notebook for a while. Then he looked up. Would you be willing to talk me through the hydrology of it, he said. The way you understand it, not the technical version, the way you would explain it to a farmer. Eldon considered this. He looked at the well. He looked at the fields around them, and at the sky, which was the clear, pale blue of early October in Kansas, with a northwest wind coming across the flat land at about 12 miles an hour. All right, he said. They walked back to the house and sat at the kitchen table. Loretta brought coffee and set it on the table without being asked, and went back to what she was doing because after 46 years she understood that the kitchen table was where things got figured out, and she made space for that without interfering with it. Eldon put his hands around his coffee cup and looked at the window for a moment and then looked at Glenn Pruitt. The Ogallala, Eldon said, is like a savings account that your great-grandfather left you. Your great-grandfather accumulated it over 10,000 years. 10,000 years of rainfall percolating down through the soil, moving slowly through sand and gravel, collecting in the rock formations below. An enormous accumulation of very patient time. And then in 1972 we started making withdrawals. Large withdrawals. 18 inches an acre per growing season across tens of thousands of acres across western Kansas. And we put back half an inch a year because that is all the rainfall and the geology will allow. He paused. You can spend a savings account, Eldon said, but you cannot spend it faster than it earns forever. Nobody argues with that principle when you say it about a bank account. But say it about water under the ground and people act like the rules are different. They are not different. The rules are the same. If you take out more than goes in, the balance goes down. And when the balance reaches zero, it does not matter how much you need or how many loans you have outstanding against it. It is gone. Glenn was writing steadily. This, well, Eldon said, is a different thing entirely. This is not the Ogallala. This is a small local system, a lens of gravel and sand sitting maybe 40 feet below the surface, fed by whatever rain falls on this particular piece of ground and filters down through the soil. It is not an ocean. It is a creek. But a creek that fills back up every year. Every time it rains on this ground, some of that water works its way down and goes into this system. Small amounts, slow, but consistent, and consistent is worth more than large over the long run. He paused again. A shallow well is like a paycheck, he said. It is smaller than a savings account. You cannot live the same way on a paycheck that you can live on a savings account, at least not right away. You have to size your life to what the paycheck brings in. But the paycheck comes back. Every pay period there is more. You can live on a paycheck your whole life if you are careful. You cannot live on a savings account forever if you are spending more than it earns. Glenn Pruitt looked up from his notebook. That is the clearest explanation of the hydrology I have ever heard, he said. It is not hydrology, Eldon said. It is arithmetic. Glenn asked if he could use Eldon's well as a case study in a report he was going to write for the Extension Service. Eldon told him he could do whatever he wanted with it. Glenn Pruitt published his report the following spring. It was titled Perched Water Tables as Supplemental Water Sources in Declining Aquifer Areas of Western Kansas, and it cited Eldon Marsh's hand-dug well as the primary case study. The report recommended that farmers in areas experiencing significant Ogallala decline explore shallow well development as a backup water source for livestock and domestic use. It included Eldon's cost figures, the $280 in materials and 4 months of personal labor, and compared them to the $35,000 center pivot loans that had been the alternative in 1972. The report was read by not very many people when it came out. This was not unusual for Extension Service reports. They tended to circulate among people who were already paying attention to things, which meant they tended to confirm what people who were already paying attention already knew. But the story of Eldon Marsh's well was spreading in a different way through a channel that does not require reports or official publications. It was spreading the way stories spread in farm country, which is to say, slowly at first from mouth to mouth at the co-op and the grain elevator and the diner on Tuesday mornings, and then faster as more people heard it and added their own understanding of it, and then everywhere. By the winter of 1988, the story was being told in counties beyond Sheridan County. A farmer in Trego County heard it from his brother-in-law. A man in Graham County heard it from his county agent. The details traveled with the story, the 42 feet, the $280, the 8 gallons a minute, the 15 years of people laughing. The fact that it had worked when nothing else did. Those details had a particular quality of sticking in the memory the way specific, concrete, true things stick when abstractions slide off. By 1994, other farmers in Sheridan County had dug or drilled shallow wells targeting perched water tables in the topographic low points of their properties. None of them had Eldon's luck with location. The northeast corner of his property sat above an unusually well-developed gravel lens that collected water efficiently from a wide catchment area. The other wells produced less. 2 gallons a minute, 3 gallons a minute. One produced 5. None of them were enough to run a center pivot. All of them were enough to water livestock to supply a household, to provide the minimum that a farm family needs to keep functioning when the larger system has failed. Enough to survive. Eldon did not take credit for this. He had not promoted himself or his well or his methods. He had answered the questions that people brought to him, shown the well to anyone who wanted to see it, explained the arithmetic to anyone who wanted to hear it. What people did with that information was their own business. He went on farming. The seasons continued in the way that seasons continue, each one different in its particulars and similar in its structure. Wheat went in the ground in the fall and came up in the spring and was harvested in early summer, and then the ground rested and built itself back up for the next planting. Eldon kept his notebooks. He tracked his yields and his costs and the drawdown reports from the State Geological Survey, which he continued to receive and read every year. The numbers in those reports were not improving. The Ogallala under Sheridan County had declined 60 feet since 1972. 40% of the original saturated thickness was gone. More wells were failing or operating at reduced capacity. The farmers who had drilled deep in the 1980s were finding that deep was not deep enough, that the water table had retreated past what their pumps could reach, no matter how far they had gone. Some farms were transitioning back to dryland production. This was not easy, as Eldon had known it would not be easy, because 15 or more years of irrigated farming had changed the soil in ways that dryland wheat farming did not accommodate. The yields on these transitioning farms were poor in the early years, worse than they would have been if the land had been farmed dry all along. Eldon's land had not changed. It was the same ground, it had always been managed the same way, producing the same consistent yields it had produced for 50 years. 25 to 30 bushels in an average rain year. Not spectacular. Not the numbers that had come off the irrigated fields in the early years of the boom, but real and paid for and repeatable. In 1991, Roy Dunham came over one afternoon in the fall and sat in the kitchen with Eldon and drank coffee and did not say very much for a while. Roy was 62 that year, a big man gone slightly thinner than he had been in the boom years, with the look of someone who has spent the last decade making decisions he cannot unmake. He had drilled his well deeper twice, he told Eldon. The second time had not helped. He was farming dryland now, wheat and sorghum on ground that had spent 15 years growing irrigated corn. His yields were coming up, but they were not where he needed them to be. He had restructured his equipment loans through the bank in 1986 and again in 1989. He was current on everything, but there was nothing extra. He said all of this looking at the kitchen table rather than at Eldon. When he was done, he looked up. I should have read that report, Roy said. Eldon did not say anything. I should have read it in 1980 when you left it at the co-op, Roy said. I picked it up and looked at the cover and put it back down. I had payments to make. I told myself I did not have time to worry about a 50-year problem. Eldon wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. It was not a 50-year problem, Roy said. It was a 15-year problem, no, Eldon said. It was always a 50-year problem. We just started it earlier than we thought. Roy was quiet for a moment. Then he said, How did you know? In 1972. How did you know what nobody else knew? Eldon thought about this. He thought about his father standing in the ruined field in the spring of 1933, letting a handful of dead topsoil fall through his fingers in the wind. He thought about the particular quality of that image, the simplicity of it, the way it had encoded something in him that no amount of official enthusiasm or financial incentive had been able to overwrite. I did not know more than anyone else, Eldon said. I just asked different questions. I asked what the recharge rate was. I asked what happens in year 51. The man from the bureau did not have an answer. That told me the answer. Roy nodded slowly. My father taught me to ask about recharge, Eldon said. Not in those words. But that was what he meant. He taught me to ask what comes back. Before you spend something, ask what comes back. If the answer is nothing or not enough, you already know the decision. Roy sat with that for a while. Then he finished his coffee and stood up and put on his hat. I appreciate you filling our tanks that summer, he said. You would have done the same, Eldon said. Roy looked at him. Would I? He said. I am not sure I would have. Not after everything. He left. Eldon sat at the kitchen table for a while after Roy's truck had gone down the county road, and Loretta came in from the other room and sat across from him without saying anything, and they sat together in the quiet of the afternoon, the way people sit together when there is nothing left that needs to be said. The years between 1991 and 1994 were the most ordinary years of Eldon Marsh's farming life, in the way that ordinary becomes something else entirely when you understand what it costs to get there. He farmed his 320 acres. He kept his records. He maintained his equipment and his fences and his well. He filled his neighbors' tanks when they needed it, which was less often now that the immediate crisis of 1987 had passed, but still occasionally in dry summers, in years when the reduced capacity Ogallala wells could not keep up even with the diminished demands being made on them. He watched the landscape change. The green circles were disappearing. Not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily the way things disappear when the condition that produced them is no longer present. An idle pivot structure here, a dry well cap there, a field that had been green in June going brown in July, because there was no water to keep it otherwise. The transformation that had seemed so permanent and so complete in the mid-1970s was reversing itself, leaving behind not the dryland fields that had preceded it, but something stranger and sadder, the ruins of a system that had consumed more than it could sustain. Eldon had expected this. He had expected it since 1972. Expecting it had not made it pleasant to watch. He taught Corbett during those years the way Walt Marsh had taught him, not through formal instruction, but through proximity and repetition. Corbett was in his early 50s by then, a capable farmer who had worked alongside his father his entire adult life and had absorbed a great deal simply by watching. But Eldon was deliberate in those years about making the principles explicit. He took Corbett to the northeast corner of the property one morning in the spring of 1992 and stood him beside the well. The first thing you check every morning is the well, Eldon said. Not the crops, not the equipment, the well, because everything else depends on this. Corbett looked at the well. He had been looking at it his whole life. He thought he knew what it was. Standing beside it that morning, he understood for the first time that he had been looking at a principle rather than a hole in the ground. The second thing Eldon said is the soil. Before you plant, before you put in a season, you look at the soil. You get your hands in it, you smell it. You feel what it is telling you about what it needs. There is no instrument that does what that does. Your hands and your nose and 40 years of attention. That is the instrument. Corbett listened. And the third thing Eldon said, before you sign anything, before you borrow anything, before you commit to any technology or any program or any plan that someone brings to you in a good suit with charts and projections, you ask what the recharge rate is. You ask what comes back. You ask what happens in year 51. He looked at his son. Every time, Eldon said, you ask it every time. It does not matter how good the numbers look or how confident the man with the chart sounds. You ask what comes back. And if the answer is not enough, you already know your decision. Corbett nodded. He did not write it down. He did not need to write it down. Some things pass between fathers and sons without requiring paper. They stood beside the well for a while longer in the spring morning air, the windmill turning, the pump running 8 gallons a minute, coming up from 42 feet below the surface of a Kansas field that had been farmed without debt and without delusion for 60 years. Eldon Marsh died on a Thursday morning in March of 1994. He was 83 years old. He had farmed 320 acres of dryland wheat in Sheridan County for 61 years. He had never installed a center pivot irrigation system. He had never borrowed money for equipment he could not pay off in the year he bought it. He had never pumped a single gallon of water from the Ogallala aquifer. His well was producing 8 gallons a minute on the morning he died. Corbett and his wife were at the house when it happened, and Loretta was there, and the ending was as quiet as the life had been in the bedroom of the farmhouse that Walt Marsh had built in 1908. There was no drama to it. There was not supposed to be any drama to it. A man who had lived without unnecessary drama for 83 years did not require it at the end. Corbett took over the farm. He was 54 years old when his father died, and he had been preparing to take over the farm his entire life without quite knowing he was preparing for it. He kept the same rotation his father had kept: wheat and sorghum and fallow, building the organic matter in the soil resting ground that needed rest. He maintained the equipment with the same careful attention. He checked the well every morning before he checked anything else. He did not change a single fundamental thing about how the farm operated. He did not need to. Everything that needed to be changed had been changed decades before he was in a position to change it. The Ogallala continued to decline. The Geological Survey reports came out every 2 years, and Corbett read them the way his father had read them, carefully and without surprise. By the year 2000, the water table in Sheridan County had dropped more than 80 feet from its 1972 level. 53% of the original saturated thickness was gone. Roughly 30% of the wells drilled during the irrigation boom were either completely dry or producing less than a quarter of their original capacity. Abandoned pivot structures stood in fields across the county, their aluminum arms bent and rust-streaked, the towers tilted where the ground had settled. A few had been dismantled for scrap. Most simply stood where they had stopped, monuments to a calculation that had not accounted for what comes back. Several farms had been sold or abandoned. Some of the families who had signed their names on that April night in 1972 were no longer farming. Corbett's 320 acres looked the same in 2001 as it had looked in 1972. Which is to say, it looked like a farm that had been worked steadily and carefully by people who understood that the ground was not an investment to be leveraged, but a place to be tended. The soil was healthy, the fences were in good repair, the equipment shed held machinery that was old but functional, maintained past the point where most people would have replaced it. And in the northeast corner of the property, the well was producing 8 gallons a minute, the same 8 gallons it had produced every day since Eldon Marsh finished lining the shaft with fieldstones in the summer of 1972. 29 years. Through drought and flood and the worst agricultural crisis in 50 years, and the slow collapse of the water system that everyone around it had depended on. 8 gallons a minute, steady as a heartbeat, recharged each year by whatever rain fell on the land above it, and filtered down through the sandy soil into the gravel lens below. In the summer of 2001, the Sheridan County Extension Service put together a display for the county fair. The subject was water conservation and aquifer management topics that had moved from the theoretical to the urgent in the 3 decades since the irrigation boom. The display occupied a large tent near the main exhibition hall, and it was more attended than displays of this kind usually are because by 2001 enough people in Sheridan County had a personal connection to the subject that it was not abstract anymore. The display had several panels. One showed the aquifer decline graph, a line that dropped steadily from 1972 to the present, losing 3 to 4 feet per year, with the slope steepening slightly in the years of heaviest pumping and flattening somewhat as the irrigated acreage declined. It was a clear factual graph, and it was hard to look at without feeling something, because the line was so consistent and the direction was so inevitable, and the whole thing had happened in such plain sight for so many years. Another panel showed photographs of abandoned center pivots. The photos had been taken by a young agricultural photographer from Kansas State who had driven the county roads the previous fall, and they were good photographs, the kind that find the beauty in something sad, the geometric precision of the tilted aluminum arms against the flat sky, the way the rust colored the metal in the low autumn light. A third panel was a timeline of the aquifer's decline with key events noted alongside the drawdown figures. 1972 irrigation boom begins. 1980 First Geological Survey warning. 1984 First wells in the county fail. 1987 drought year, multiple wells dry. 1990s large-scale abandonment of irrigated acres. And in the center of the display, mounted in a frame, was a photograph. The photograph had been taken in 1973 by Loretta Marsh on a Kodak camera she had bought through a catalog. It showed Eldon Marsh standing beside his hand-dug well. He was 62 years old in the photograph, lean in the shoulders and thick through the forearms, with his hat pushed back on his head and a tin cup of water in his right hand. He was looking at the camera without smiling, not because he was unhappy, but because smiling was not what the moment called for. It was the look of a man who is simply present where he is without performance and without apology. The caption below the photograph read as follows: Eldon Marsh, Sheridan County, Kansas. In 1972, while his neighbors installed center pivot irrigation systems drawing from the Ogallala Aquifer, Eldon Marsh dug this well by hand using a shovel and pickaxe. The well is 42 feet deep, cost $280 in materials, and took 4 months to complete. It taps a shallow perched water table recharged by annual rainfall. It has produced 8 gallons per minute every day since 1972. The Ogallala beneath his neighbors' farms has declined by more than 80 feet in the same period. Corbett Marsh was 61 years old in the summer of 2001, the same age his father had been in April of 1972. He stood at the back of the tent and read the caption. He had known the story his entire life, had lived inside it, and alongside it had been present for many of the moments it described. But reading it on a card beside a framed photograph of his father standing with a tin cup of water, he felt something settle in him that he had not known was unsettled. He stood there for a while without saying anything. A few people walked past and looked at the photograph and moved on. An older woman stopped and read the caption twice and shook her head slowly. A farmer Corbett recognized from the north end of the county stood and looked at the abandoned pivot photographs for a long time before moving on. Nobody spoke to Corbett. He did not announce himself. He was just a man in his 60s standing at the back of a tent at a county fair looking at a photograph of his father. Now let me tell you what happened in the week that followed, because this is the part of the story that most people who know it have never heard, because Corbett Marsh was not a man who talked about himself, and the people who were in that room had no way of knowing who they were looking at. On the Thursday of County Fair Week, a meeting was held at the Sheridan County Community Center. The same room, the same linoleum floor, the same metal folding chairs that had been replaced twice over the decades, but were essentially the same chairs. The meeting was called by a development company out of Wichita, A company with a clean logo and a professional website and representatives who wore good clothes that were slightly wrong for the setting, the way clothes from a city are always slightly wrong for a farm county. The company had a proposal. They had developed, they said, a new technology for managed aquifer recovery. The idea was to use existing well infrastructure to pump treated municipal wastewater back into the Ogallala at strategic locations, supplementing the natural recharge with engineered recharge. They had projections, they had charts, they had a financing structure involving federal and state partnerships that would make the program accessible to farmers at low cost. The presentation lasted 45 minutes. It was polished and confident and full of numbers that sounded good if you did not stop to examine them closely. When it was finished, the presenter asked if there were questions. The room was quiet for a moment, then a man in the third row asked about the cost structure. Another man asked about the timeline for results. A woman from the water district asked about regulatory requirements. The conversation moved through the room the way these conversations do, circling around the edges of the central question without quite landing on it. At the back of the room, Corbett Marsh had been sitting quietly since the beginning of the meeting. He had not planned to come. He had stopped at the community center on his way back from the feed store and seen the cars in the parking lot and the sign by the door and gone in without quite deciding to. He raised his hand. The presenter looked at him. Yes, sir. Corbett said, what is the recharge rate of this system? The managed recharge. How much water per acre per year does your program put back into the aquifer? The presenter consulted a chart. At full implementation, the program would add an estimated 1 to 2 inches of water per year across the service area. 1 to 2 inches per year, Corbett said. Yes, sir. That represents a significant improvement over the natural recharge rate of approximately half an inch per year. Corbett nodded slowly. And how much water per acre per year would the farmers in this program be pumping out? The presenter paused. The pumping rates would vary depending on individual farm operations and crop choices. Roughly, Corbett said. What is the average pumping rate for irrigated corn in this county? The room was very quiet. Approximately 18 inches per acre per growing season, the presenter said. So, you are putting back 1 to 2 inches, Corbett said, and pulling out 18. His voice was level and without heat. He was not trying to embarrass anyone. He was trying to do arithmetic in public the way his father had done it in a parking lot in 1972. The presenter said, the program is designed to slow the rate of decline rather than reverse it entirely at this stage. Corbett said, and what happens in year 51? The presenter looked at him. I will tell you what happens, Corbett said. The same thing that happened with the original program. The balance runs to zero. And then you need another program. And by then, whatever is left of the aquifer will determine what kind of program is still possible. He paused. I am not saying your technology does not work, Corbett said. I am saying the arithmetic does not change. You cannot take out more than goes back in. Not forever. And anything that is built on the assumption that you can is not a solution. It is a delay. And delays have a cost that gets paid by the people who come after us. The room was completely silent. Corbett looked down at the table for a moment and then looked at the presenter. What is the actual recharge rate of this program under conservative assumptions, he said. Not the optimistic projection, the conservative one. And what happens to the farmers in this program when the gap between that rate and their pumping rate produces the same result that the original program produced? Those are my questions. The presenter did not have good answers to those questions. He had answers the way prepared men always have answers, but they were the kind of answers that fill the space without filling the question, and the people in the room could feel the difference. After the meeting, several farmers came up to Corbett outside the building. He did not know most of them by name. They asked him where he was from, what he farmed, how he had come to ask those particular questions in that particular way. He told them he farmed dryland wheat on 320 acres in the northwest part of the county. He told them his father had drilled those questions into him the way you drill something into a son, not with a textbook, but with 30 years of watching and listening and doing the arithmetic out loud at the kitchen table. One man, a farmer from the south end of the county who appeared to be about 40, asked Corbett what he would recommend instead of the managed recharge program. Corbett looked at him for a moment. I would recommend you find out if you have a perched water table on your property, he said. If you have a topographic low where the grass stays green longer than everywhere else. If you do get your hands in the soil at the lowest point and feel how far down the moisture goes. And then think about a shallow well, not 800 gallons a minute, maybe 2 or 3, maybe 5. Enough for your livestock and your household and a margin of insurance against a dry year. Something that comes back every year on its own. The man said, That sounds like the old way. Corbett said, It is the old way. The old way is the one that is still working. He drove home on the county road with the windows down. It was a warm evening in July, the light going long and golden across the flat fields, and the air smelled of cut wheat and dry ground, and the particular clean smell of Kansas summer coming off the land at dusk. He turned onto the drive that led to the farmhouse his grandfather had built in 1908, and he parked in the yard and sat for a moment with the engine off. Then he got out and walked to the northeast corner of the property, to the well, to the hand pump and the windmill and the fieldstone lining that his father had laid with his own hands in the summer of 1972, 29 years ago, when Corbett was a young man and the county was full of optimism and green circles and the confidence that comes from having found a way to make the desert bloom without counting the costs. He put his hand on the pump handle. The windmill was turning slowly in the evening wind. The water in the pipe was moving upward 8 gallons a minute, steady and unhurried and indifferent to everything that had happened above it in the past 3 decades. He stood there for a while in the long summer light. He was 61 years old, the same age his father had been when he drove home from a Tuesday night meeting and started digging by hand the next morning. Eldon Marsh had looked at the same evening light over the same field 61 years into his own life, and made a calculation that nobody around him agreed with, and then gone home and acted on it without waiting for permission or consensus or the comfort of company. Corbett understood now what that had cost his father. Not the $280 and the 4 months of labor. The other cost. The years of standing alone in a certainty that you cannot prove to anyone who has not done the arithmetic, the patience of watching people make mistakes. You cannot stop them from making the particular loneliness of knowing something true in a language the room is not ready to hear. And he understood what his father had left him. Not just the farm and the well and the clear title to 320 acres of good dry land ground. The thing Walt Marsh had given Eldon in that ruined field in 1933, the thing Eldon had carried for 60 years, and passed to Corbett in 100 quiet mornings, at the kitchen table, and at the fence line and beside this well side. The question, the one that cuts through every presentation and every projection and every promise of free water. The one that Howard Cates had not been able to answer in a parking lot in 1972. The one that the man from Wichita had not been able to answer in the community center that afternoon. What comes back? The pump ran, the water came up the pipe, the windmill turned in the evening air over Sheridan County, Kansas, and somewhere under the ground below. Corbett's feet, a small and local and sustainable system, recharged itself from the rain that fell on the land above it, the same way it had recharged itself every year since before anyone alive could remember, and the same way it would recharge itself long after everyone who had argued about it was gone. Corbett Marsh took his hand off the pump handle and walked back to the house. The well kept running. Sometimes the man who digs by hand sees deeper than the man who drills by machine, and sometimes free is the most expensive word in the English language. Eldon Marsh knew that. He knew it at 61, standing in a parking lot doing math that nobody else wanted to do. 18 inches out, half an inch back. He went home and dug a hole, and the hole outlasted everything built above it. His son knew it too. You could tell by the way he set down the pen.